All right, so we'll kind of pick up where we left off, kind of talking about discrimination. We'll look at a couple papers today, talking about some kind of linear regressions, and I'll probably even show you how to find a paper using Google Scholar because I don't have the file. I need to find it. So I figured we could do that together in class. So I think we left off, we hadn't quite yet talked about consumer discrimination. So we talked about employer discrimination and employee discrimination. Another one that's a little bit more direct or easier to think about is going to be consumer discrimination. So let's assume that every player and team is non-discriminatory, but that consumers have some kind of discrimination, or what we've been calling kind of this taste for discrimination. So what that would mean is that they're going to incur an additional cost if they're kind of watching the game, purchasing tickets, all of these things. So what will the labor market impacts of that be? Well, to understand the labor market impacts, we're going to have to understand the impacts of what consumer discrimination would do kind of to the overall market for the games being played or tickets being sold. So really, if we go back and we think about for all the products, right, whether or not this is tickets, right, whether or not this is apparel, whether or not this is the broadcasting rights that they're selling, of all these things, right, are going to see a decrease in demand because the marginal benefit now to consuming all of these products being put out by the league for these consumers who are discriminatory is going to be less, right? Their marginal benefit is going to be reduced by this additional cost, right? Whatever their benefit was before, it's going to be that minus, added in this additional cost, which is a negative value. Okay. So, and I've been trying to kind of get at this. Oh, I thought this was on the dot cam. It's not. So if we're one thing I've been trying to kind of hammer home is this idea. Oh, let's zoom down a little bit. Okay. That our demand curve for labor is composed of two things. Basically, the amount of additional revenue each win brings in and how many wins that unit of labor or that player brings in, if you think about it. So what's going to happen, in things like the ticket market, right? We see that there's a decrease in demand, so fewer tickets sold or potentially the same tickets sold at a lower price. So even if we just think about the win market, where we have this constant marginal cost, we're going to go from our original demand and marginal revenue curve here to seeing a reduction in that demand and marginal revenue curve after discrimination, right? Because now there's this additional cost to those consumers. So our marginal revenue per win is kind of going down, right? So our marginal revenue curve is shifting. So we can think about what impact is that going to have on the labor market. So our supply of labor. So maybe here was the demand curve for labor before. Call this the first one. What we're going to see is this kind of, right, decrease in my marginal revenue per win, or this decrease in that demand curve for labor, right? Because essentially, if consumers aren't willing to pay as much as they were before, the value of every single player has now been reduced, right? The demand for every player has now been reduced because the amount of additional revenue that they will bring into the team has went down. So you can kind of predict consumer discrimination, what's the impact that that's going to have. The league overall, we're going to see wages decrease. We'll call this 1, and then we'll call this W2, quantity of labor 2. Right? So we're kind of see the overall number of players potentially in the league decrease. It just makes more sense if consumers are discriminatory and they have less demand for the product overall, we might see fewer teams exist, right? Or, if it got that extreme. But we would also predict that we see kind of lower wages as well, right? And this is the idea that, you know, if we do have a discriminatory consumer base, those players aren't going to be, you know, aren't going to have as much value to that team. Now, a problem occurs, right? If this is just overall in the sport, that's one thing, right? There's discrimination out there. So, you know, we could use the example, as soon as Major League Baseball was integrated, there's maybe a lot of people that stopped watching. And so the overall kind of wages in that league might have went down a bit. And we might have seen kind of fewer kind of players being employed, right? Maybe teams didn't have as many minor league kind of affiliates and things like that. But what's more problematic is if this consumer discrimination doesn't occur against the league, right? But potentially just the players, right, who are in the group that they're discriminating against. So you can imagine with consumer discrimination, it could go to the scenario where we'll use kind of the integration of Major League Baseball. Maybe the demand curve for, well, I'll just redraw this instead of trying to reuse an old one. So our quantity of labor and our wages, we'll assume that the supply is the same for kind of black and white players, right, at that time of integration. So here is kind of our demand curve. And even if we assume away, like let's assume that the quality of the players is identical, right? So here would be our demand curve for white players. And, you know, those white players, when they're on the team, there's no, consumers aren't discriminating against white players. So my team isn't impacted by this, right? People don't want to buy fewer of my jerseys. They don't want to go 10 fewer games. So my marginal revenue curve might not be impacted when I'm adding white players to my team. However, if consumers have this taste for discrimination, the demand curve will shift down in the labor market, but only for those players that they're discriminating against. In our example, black players at the time of integration in Major League Baseball. Right? So if I add, right, these are two players, we held kind of the quality constant, but they were still going to see a shift downward in the demand for that group that was being discriminated against because of this taste for discrimination. So these players would, you know, the true value should be here for both white and black players of the same quality. But because those black players consumers are discriminating against, and they might not buy as many tickets, they might not buy as many jerseys, we're going to see this downward shift in the demand curve for labor from that group that consumers discriminate against. And because they're not worth as much to the team. If they add a black player of the similar quality as a white player, well, now they have to incur all this discrimination from consumers. And so we see that, you know, wages being paid to black players are going to end up being lower than the wages being paid to white players, right? And this is really all just trickle down, starting with consumer discrimination. You know, the products consumers buy, we'll see a quantity decrease in tickets and apparel that impacts the marginal revenue per win for these teams that decide to employ this group that consumers discriminate against. Okay. Is someone asking a question? Or someone just accidentally has their mic on? Maybe I'm
sorry, that's my bad.
Oh, you're okay. I was just going to make sure you weren't asking a question and I couldn't hear it. All right. Any questions on that before we keep moving? So, you know, this really operates pretty similar to employer discrimination. Like the end result is the same in terms of it lowers wages and the quantity of labor. It's really just acting through instead of an additional cost. Right before there was like this additional cost that the employer took on if they were discriminatory. Now it's just because the consumers are discriminatory that almost forces like an additional cost to hiring a player of whatever the group that consumers are discriminating against. So it acts in a very similar way. It's just kind of, it starts with the consumer as opposed to starting with the employer. Any questions on this? All right, so, you know, I kind of already talked through this. You know, these consumer discrimination is going to impact the products first because the marginal revenue is then going to go down. We see a downward shift in the demand curve for labor. And there's been some studies out there on this. So Kane and Scher, I think it's Kahn actually. I said Kane, it's Kahn and Scher, found that they ran this regression where they were trying, they had all this performance data over these players, and they tried to hold constant kind of the quality level based off all these, I think this was the NBA. Yeah. So, same points per game, rebounds per game, et cetera, same age. And they found that all else equal, black players actually earned 20% less than kind of otherwise identical white players. And that they also not only looked at kind of the pay, so they said, well, is this evidence that teams are being discriminatory? Well, it's not discrimination coming from the employer if we can find that, the employers are just reacting to the incentives, right, of their consumer base. So they looked at kind of attendance, and they did the same thing, trying to hold constant quality, and they found that a black player replaced with an otherwise identical white player actually increased attendance annually by 8,000 to 13,000, right? So this is some evidence that consumers, right, are actually attending fewer games. So it's actually, these difference in wages is actually starting with the consumer discrimination that's going on. And that the employers are just reacting to the fact that they have higher attendance when they had an otherwise equal white player. So this is like even more damning, right? It's not the NBA that has a problem. It's us, right? It's the U.S. It's these individuals who are attending the games. The discrimination is starting with the consumers of these products. Okay. So not great news. Now this was a little bit older data. I haven't seen anybody reproduce it in kind of more recent times, but still, I think if I remember right, this was published around kind of early 2000s, so their data was likely coming from kind of like 80s to 90s. All right. So we talked a little bit last class about statistical discrimination. And, we said that with statistical discrimination, you believe that a certain group, I kind of use like the height example, but you could do, break this up by race as well. That if, for whatever reason, I have some archaic belief or something that, this specific race is only good at playing these certain positions on the team. Well, that's going to lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because I'm going to give fewer opportunities to people of that race to play those positions. So this is kind of an older breakdown, but in 2004, we've got kind of the racial breakdown of every single position. And, you can kind of see whether or not this is selection of the players or something that, the opportunities aren't being given to them by the teams. We definitely have a very different racial breakdown at different positions. You can kind of see here, with pitchers and catchers, right? We're predominantly kind of white and kind of Latino category here. But when we look at like first and second base, and especially outfield, black players start to make up a much higher percentage in that position, right? So maybe it's because this is, the self-fulfilling prophecy of certain beliefs that the different, players of different race are better at different positions. And so they're just not given as many opportunities in those positions that the teams are holding this kind of statistical discrimination. So this is kind of is good evidence of that. But, part of this is also going to be that if we're just looking at the pay of different positions, right, we know that possibly, we'll come back to this in a second, that when we're thinking about the labor market, if we were going to put multiple positions on the same graph, right? So let's say I've got the same supply curve for labor for both, let's do an NFL example. We'll do quarterback because I think it's a little bit more stark of a difference. And the supply curve of, we'll do kickers, right? And maybe there's some arguments here that I'm going to make that maybe you don't fully agree with, but stay with me for a second. So here's our demand curve for labor for quarterbacks, right? If we think about the demand curve for labor for a quarterback relative to a kicker, well, assuming they're on the same team, right? We're kind of thinking about the same marginal revenue per win. Even if we hold that constant, the marginal wins kind of come from adding that quarterback are likely different than the marginal number of wins that are added when I add a kicker to my roster. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yep, there you go. So if we think that this marginal revenue per win, if we're looking at the same team, that's constant, but if the quarterback has a larger influence on my team than the kicker, then the demand curve for labor is going to be higher for that quarterback, right? So we can kind of think about, we could actually break down wage differences. So here's the wage of the kicker. And we'll kind of do here is the wage of the quarterback. We can think about different positions are going to be paid higher amounts. Well, if black players aren't given as many opportunities to play quarterback, then when we look at averages, of course the black average wage is going to be lower, right? Because they're not being given as many opportunities kind of to play the higher paid position, right? And it could work the other way as well. I think if we look at the baseball data, you know, some of it, you know, some of the positions that we have there that are a higher percentage black are actually like outfielders, and some of the that tend to be kind of can be paid higher starting, you know, average salaries in like second baseman and third baseman. So it depends on which league we're looking at and which way that's gonna go. But if there's discrimination about, or statistical discrimination that leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy, where certain positions we see a higher composition or higher percentage of a certain race, well, if that position is paid more or less, then when we look at the averages between two races, it's going to. So we might have to break this down by position, right? And see, okay, if I look at white and black quarterbacks, do I see a wage differential? Because there's nothing here that would predict that unless we have discrimination going on, right? However, if black quarterbacks aren't given as many opportunities, we may not see kind of the wages of overall all black players be kind of the same as overall all white players, or, you know, whatever two groups we're looking at. So we kind of have this wage difference predicted. But another interesting thing, we're thinking about positions, and I think the NFL is pretty kind of a good example of this. Oh, the cap's on the wrong colors. You can also think about the quantity here. So I could think about like the quantity of quarterbacks and the quantity of kickers. And some of this is just going to be dictated by how games are played. But, you know, and there's more that goes into this as well. But this would also predict that I carry fewer kickers on my team than I do quarterbacks, which if you look at most rosters, there's definitely a higher number of quarterbacks on that roster than there is kickers as well. But mainly I was kind of using this to focus on the wages here. Okay, so it could vary by position. So notice that I think I said the outfield had the highest percentage of, say, black players, you know, whereas third base and kind of shortstop and catchers are the lowest. Well, when I look at the actual salaries, who gets paid the most? Looks like it's first basemen and starting pitchers. If I look at first basemen and kind of pitchers here, kind of a lower percentage of black players are pitchers. So of course their overall average wage is going to be impacted, right? Now there's not as much variation in some of the other positions, but you can kind of see our outfielders here, about 5 million, shortstops and catchers around 3. So maybe kind of black players aren't impacted as much by this positional discrimination because they're ending up in one of these positions that is kind of a little bit higher paid than some of the others. All right. Any questions over anything up to this point? Okay. I kind of already talked about this, but we've got like statistical discrimination going on, self-fulfilling prophecies that lead to these lower wages. Right? That's kind of what we had drawn there. Now, what is, I use the quarterback example for a reason to think about if black players haven't been given as many opportunities, we're not going to see as many black quarterbacks. We know that they're the highest paid player in most cases on every team. But on average, it's easily the highest paid position in the NFL. So, that's a really good example of if we have statistical, just because historically there hasn't been as many, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be giving opportunities to that race to play that position moving forward. And if you don't, well, then you're going to end up with, they don't even have the ability to earn these higher wages at these positions that are paid a higher amount. So that's kind of how we can think about positional and kind of statistical discrimination existing. So that kind of carries us kind of through some different types of discrimination that we could think about impacting wages of different groups based off of race. We did foreign domestic. We thought about kind of over or under 6 foot tall for the quarterback position. But what about gender discrimination? So it's a little bit harder. We don't have a lot of great examples where we can really identify whether or not gender discrimination is going on. Okay? So a lot of the times, you know, there aren't a lot of sports that are mixed in terms of gender. And so, you know, we often see them in the same venues, but usually they have, right, there's usually a kind of women's league and a men's league, right? So it gets harder. As soon as we start to compare across leagues, it becomes harder to identify if actual discrimination is occurring. Okay? So if we're thinking about, so you know, we do have some evidence, like maybe some golf, or maybe we kind of had some auto racing where we had, but not a lot, right? So is the lack of women in these sports, you know, is it discrimination or something else? So I mean, we could dive into kind of physical differences. We could dive into kind of social kind of norms of you know, women only competing against women and men only competing against men. But we really want to kind of focus on is, okay, if we do have separate leagues, is there any way we can identify discrimination between those leagues? So if we didn't have discrimination, right, it would have to be that it's working through one of these two components, right? The marginal revenue per win, or I wrote it here as the marginal product of labor, but it's kind of been traditionally writing this as the marginal wins, right? Because the product here is wins in our sport examples. So we're going to look at two things, because, you know, if I could think of, you know, the WNBA and the NBA as you know, it's the same sport. There's small differences. So why do we, when we look at wages, why is it significantly lower wages in the WNBA? Right? Well, it's going to work very similar. So we've got our supply curve. Let's just assume that the NBA and the WNBA have an identical supply curve. We've got the demand curve for labor in the NBA, and we know that the demand curve for labor is composed of two components: the marginal revenue per win and the number of additional wins a player brings in. So if we had otherwise two identical quality players, and when I say quality, it doesn't even have to be that if they went head to head, right? They're in different leagues. So as long as they're bringing in the same number of additional wins, right? So maybe think about, take the top player in the WNBA and the top player in the NBA. Let's assume that they bring in the same number of additional wins to their team. The problem's going to be, right, if we look at wages for that highest quality player, and that's the wages for the NBA. It's going to be a little bit tough on this next one. It would have to be that if we see lower wages in the WNBA, right? Well, we would know that the demand curve would, you know, see lower wages, the demand curve would be lower. So it must be operating, if we're holding quality constant, through this marginal wins per, you know, marginal revenue per win, sorry. So what's some evidence maybe we could see that this marginal revenue per win is lower? Well, this is where we're going to look at all the revenue sources and see, is this just in general, or do we see lower overall revenues in ticket sales and broadcast rights? And so, and I'll leave this up here if you're still kind of on. You know, if we look at just the attendance, right, that's some idea, like how many tickets are being sold, kind of the average number of tickets being sold to a game. Well, baseball is quite a bit higher. NFL is a lot higher. You've got NBA and NHL kind of, you know, they're usually capped by their stadium size. Now, if we look down here, we've got the WNBA and kind of minor league baseball kind of with similar numbers. Right? I think this was just using AAA. So attendance is quite a bit lower, right? Which is an indicator that demand for that sport overall is lower from our consumer basis, right? Now, it's not the only thing that matters. You can imagine, even if the WNBA and the NBA had similar numbers, so let's say they're both kind of selling out their stadiums, what's another thing I would want to look at to make sure that demand was either the same or was different between these two leagues? So even if they're both selling out their stadiums, what else could be different in terms of revenue? So what is revenue composed of? If we think about total revenue, that's going to be price times quantity. So even if I am looking at the ticket market and I see the same quantity of tickets, it could be that demand is high enough in both leagues to sell out, but demand in one league could be a lot higher such that the price was higher. So we don't just want to look at kind of attendance here. We would also want to look at price, right? Because even if the WNBA had a lower attendance, if the ticket price of their game was $1,000, well, we might be similar in revenue, right? So we don't just want to look at quantity. We want to look at price as well when we're thinking about these, thinking about revenue across these different leagues. So, we're looking at ticket sales, merchandise sales, TV viewer ratings, really any metric we have of kind of demand for the sport, it just is overall lower for the WNBA. So it's not that the WNBA is discriminating against women by paying them lower wages. It's just responding to the incentive. It's responding to what products they're selling, right? The different revenue sources that they're making money on. So ticket sales, merchandise, selling TV rights, etc. Okay. So, if we have lower demand overall, lower marginal revenue per win, right? Right here, we predict a lower demand curve and we end up seeing lower overall wages, right? So it's really hard to compare across leagues to see because what could be existing is, so I just explained an economic principle that could describe why we see differences in male and female wages here, right? That was purely economical and driven off of how much additional revenue that female athletes in the WNBA were generating versus what male athletes were. But what could be the case, right, is that this is what should be the true gap in wages. But if we have discrimination going on against kind of female athletes, well, what's going to happen? The differences in the demand curve here were driven off of actual differences in how much money they were generating. But we could also have this additional consumer discrimination that would force kind of the WNBA's demand curve even lower and actually end up seeing even lower wages than without discrimination. So you can think about this as plus discrimination, right? So just because we see that gap and we say, well, look, we look at all these metrics, right? We see kind of lower ticket sales, about all this stuff. Well, yeah, that says that wages should be lower, but probably we have to do a little bit more work to figure out, well, is the gap actually larger than what it should be, right? And that's that's a difficult thing for a statistician to do. Kind of would dive into something like that more, probably like an econometric course where you're looking at kind of better understanding of regression analysis and how to account for differences in marginal revenue and just kind of picking up kind of whether or not there's lower wages being paid that can't be explained or that we could attribute to discrimination. Any other questions on that? Or any questions on that before we keep moving? All right. So are there any exceptions to kind of, if we're comparing male, I use WNBA and NBA, there's not a lot of competing leagues, like there's no women's NFL or, but one that we can look at, a lot of individual sports, we can start to look at differences between men and women. So one good one was that women's TV ratings for tennis are actually very comparable to men's, right? Now, price differences here don't really play a role because when it just comes to viewing TV, right, it's an individual cost, right? Whatever your individual cost of that hour is, that's the cost of watching the, especially if it's just on network TV, that's the cost of watching the game. So we've got a similar cost or price to watching the game. And so here we can just focus on quantity. And when we look at that, it's a lot more, it's pretty close for male and female tennis. And we see comparable salaries there. So looks like maybe there's not as much consumer discrimination, that maybe that's good evidence that there's no consumer discrimination. We said we couldn't really determine that very easily using something like the NBA and WNBA because there was differences in the marginal revenue per win. But if we have things, that are comparable to on the marginal revenue per win, there we should be seeing similar wages, and you do. If you look at some sports, you could argue that there's reverse discrimination. So like figure skating and gymnastics. Now, there could be some differences in marginal revenues in female versus male gymnastics as well. Their overall revenue levels aren't very high compared to these other major leagues, but you know, they still do exist. And so if we wanted to really figure out, well, is women being paid more in gymnastics than men's gymnastics, and you know, is that evidence of discrimination? Or we would need more information on how much revenue male and female gymnastic programs are kind of the league, I guess. I don't know exactly the name of it. Exactly what the difference in their marginal revenue per win looks like, right? To determine whether or not women being paid more in gymnastics is actually discrimination, right? It would basically be what we did before with the NBA, WNBA. It would just be that the kind of genders are flipped there, right? Or the leagues are flipped, where the female league could have a higher demand curve because it's generating more revenue per win. And then we also, in figure skating, kind of a similar idea. You know, a more interesting one, and I haven't seen any research out there using UFC or MMA data, but you know, if you look at some of the prize purses paid to kind of top females versus some of the top males, like at one point Ronda Rousey, I mean, the salaries at the top start to look pretty similar. But you know, we also could do things like break it down, like if they're fighting in the same, you know, day and the same event, they have very comparable win-loss records, you know, try to control for all these factors. The UFC data, you know, would be another good one where we could figure out, is there actual discrimination going on? Because on all these other metrics, we have otherwise identical fighters, right? But one of them is getting paid lower, then, you know, maybe that's evidence that either the employer is discriminatory or we might have some consumer discrimination going on as well. All right. Where are we at on time? Okay. So another, Amanda Nunez. So I can't remember all the numbers off the top of my head, but like Amanda Nunez and the UFC, I've heard that her pay isn't comparable to men. So it might be interesting on one of these, you know, if you could compare the big events, hold constant, like I said, win-loss records, kind of the quality of the opponent, all these things. It'd be interesting to see if you're actually predicting that she should be paid a higher amount and that we do have discrimination. But I said, I haven't seen anybody really dive into that or any new research that's using UFC data, but that is kind of the idea of what we'd want to do. Another area in which we could look at gender discrimination in sports. So we don't have a lot of crossover in terms of mixed sports where we have mixed participation of athletes, but we do have a sport where we see a lot of kind of variation in the gender of the coach. So if we look at NCAA basketball, so men's and women's basketball, you know, most men's, actually, I don't know if there is a currently, probably some smaller school, but the vast majority, right, of men's basketball teams are coached by men. But if you look at women's basketball teams, there's actually quite a few, both male and female. So if we're looking at NCAA women's basketball, right, so men are more likely to be paid higher amounts, right? The male, if you're coaching a men's team, those salaries are higher than when we look at coaches who are coaching a women's team. This goes back to the NBA, WNBA discussion. It could just be that demand for the sport is a little bit lower, and so then the demand curve in the labor market's a little bit lower as well, right? However, if we look just at women's NCAA basketball coaches, you know, we might ask the question like, well, they're within the same league. So now that marginal revenue per win, right, that's the same, right? And if the player is of equal quality, it shouldn't matter. And so the demand curve for kind of coaches shouldn't be impacted at all by their gender, right? If we're within the same league, right? If we actually look at it, evidence is that there is slightly higher earnings by women's basketball coaches, which is some discrimination against men. And they find that maybe there's a little bit of this going on in golf as well at the collegiate level, although, you know, I don't know. It's not exactly a big revenue generator, and so it's kind of harder to really, I don't know, compare that to things that are generating high amounts of revenue. But it's as simple as we could do here is just control for all the coaches win-loss record, all these other, I guess, years in the league, age, experience in the NCAA women's coaching, and then just include an indicator, which is a 1 if they're a male coach, 0 if not, and look at that coefficient. And if that's statistically anything different from 0, right, if we find that it's statistically significant, well, that would tell us that there's some evidence that there's coaching discrimination going on, or discrimination going on with the pay of coaches in NCAA women's basketball. So that's really the best case that we have. And so, I always think about this in a lot of ways. Whenever we talk about discrimination, I think depending on your own attributes, you think about it in a certain way, right? And so we've discussed several, here we have evidence that maybe there's discrimination going on against men kind of when they're a women's basketball coach, but we also have evidence that potentially women are being discriminated against in sports like tennis, where we see comparable kind of revenue numbers, but they're paid a little bit less. And so it could be that we really have discrimination going on in multiple ways, right? Maybe there's parts of our consumer base that's discriminatory towards men and parts of our consumer base that are discriminatory towards women. Right? So we could see this, and it might be dependent on the sport. So we can see discrimination going in, either direction, right? Depending on what sport we're looking at. All right, so this is the one that, well, I think I have most of the paper in here, so I don't think we have to Google search the paper, but after we go through it, I'll kind of Google Scholar search for you and show you how we could find a paper that we know exists. So speaking of kind of discrimination in coaching, let's look at kind of racial discrimination that could occur. So from 1992 to 2002, we had minorities, basically non-white coaches, filled 7 of 92 head coaching positions. 2003 to 2013, they filled 17 of 87, which 2003 was the year in which the Rooney Rule began. Right? So the Rooney Rule, I think it's kind of progressing to something that's even more complicated now, but the initial idea was just simply requiring teams to interview someone who was a minority candidate. Right? So just trying to get those opportunities, right? We talked about self-fulfilling prophecies because of statistical discrimination. This was just trying to provide opportunities, right, for minority coaches. So, if we look at all coaches, right, about 72%, so this includes coordinators and wide receivers coaches, right? We've got about a 70 kind of 30 breakdown. So what's causing there to be a higher percentage of white coaches versus black coaches or minority coaches in the NFL when a large part of the player base is kind of are minorities, right? Non-white. So maybe it's that it's allocative, right? So that it's not that they're not hiring black coaches, right, for the head football position, but they're not hiring them as offensive, defensive coordinators. And if offensive and defensive coordinators are the candidates that are most likely to get the promotion, as opposed to, a linebackers coach or even a quarterbacks coach or something like that, well, then they're not ever going to get, they're already being put in a position where it's less likely they become a head coach in the future, right? So that could be kind of one way we're seeing this. Within job would be that even if we're both hired as an offensive coordinator, for whatever reason, when we look at the data, there's some discrimination going on where 2 offensive coordinators, if one's black, they're less likely to be promoted to the head coach, right? So that's a little bit more of like kind of maybe this overt discrimination, where allocative is just that some of these self-fulfilling prophecies end up with black coaches on a track where it's less likely that they can become promoted to a head coach. Okay? So you can kind of think about the hierarchy is really, you got your head coach, you have your offensive and defensive coordinator, and they each have kind of their own position coaches, right? So the ones that are most likely to get promoted to head coach are going to be your coordinators, right? And that if you're kind of starting out down here, maybe it's less likely. And I think if I remember right, if I can remember the results of this paper, I think quarterback coaches actually are also more likely to be promoted to head coaches than some of these other positions, but we'll see. That I know that's in the data. So if we look here, we can break this down to be what position is the first position that a coach gets in their kind of coaching lifetime or career. Well, here we've got some odd ones where people who have never coached before, their very first position is a head coach, a defensive coordinator, or an offensive coordinator. If you notice, the only people over that time frame from 92 to I think it was 2013, there wasn't a single minority candidate whose first job was a head coach, defensive coordinator, or offensive coordinator. Now, there was very few white individuals given that opportunity, but they were the only ones given that opportunity. So just right off of the bat, a simple little graph like this, we're seeing like, well, sure looks like there's some opportunities at those higher levels that are being given only to kind of white candidates, right? But there's some goofy things going on here where most of these individuals were like college coaches, and that's why they're, so, you know, we're going to hold off completely by saying that, but it looks like some evidence. But then notice kind of your first coaching job, a quarterback coach, right? I mean, if you look at the numbers, I'm guessing this was like one minority candidate and like 9 or 10 kind of white candidates. So pretty high proportion of your quarterback coaches or coaches who start out as a quarterback coach are white. Well, as we look at like defensive back coaches, wide receivers, running back, and defensive line, those all have a much higher percentage of black. So we can see there's definitely differences in the racial composition of where, you know, depending on your race, what your first coaching position is. Well, in this scenario, if it's less likely that I can get promoted to head coach by being a defensive back coach, but it's more likely I can be hired as a head coach if I'm a quarterback coach, well, right away, the discrimination kind of already started at a lower level, but it's going to lead to that we see more white coaches then being hired as head coaches because they're being given their first job in a position that is more likely to be promoted to head coach, or, you know, even to coordinators, right? I won't waste time on that one, on that graph, but it was something in the paper, but I don't want to waste too much time on that today. So what was this? Percent of players, I think this is percent of coaches who played the same position that they coached in college, or played the same position in college that they're currently coaching, right? As a positions coach. So you can kind of see we've got more kind of previous, like if they were ex-players, more of these black players are being hired at the position that they played, right? And more white players are being hired at the position that they played. Right? So if there's any racial differences in the racial composition across the different positions on an NFL team, which if we look at the data, there definitely is, right? If you're looking at kind of linemen versus a quarterback versus running backs, there's definitely differences in the racial composition, and certain positions have a higher percentage of white and certain positions have a higher percentage of black. So if you're more likely to hire the black coach at the position that they played, and those positions aren't ones that are easily promoted to head coach, this is going to cause there to be fewer black coaches in the league as well. Right? So what this paper did was they tried to control for all this stuff, and basically they had this indicator variable, which was a 0 if the coach was not white and 1 if they were. Right? Our kind of dependent variables here were whether or not I was hired as different types of coaches, right? So I think this one, we've got most of the regressions are whether or not you were hired to be a head coach. So the linear regression we're thinking about here, it's called a logit regression because our dependent variable, right, was were you promoted to head coach, right? So that's our y variable, our dependent variable. We then have our intercept. And then down here we had whether or not that coach was white and a bunch of different control variables, okay? So this coefficient is going to tell us the increase in that y variable from if a coach was white instead of black, right? Well, if our y variable is just a 0 to 1, you can almost think about the interpretation of our coefficient is the increase or decrease in the probability of your y variable, which in this case would be an increase or decrease in the probability of being promoted to head coach. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to run this regression, and the results are kind of interesting. Now, notice I use those stars to denote if this is statistically different from 0. So anytime I don't see these stars, I can't say whether or not this effect of being white has any impact on the probability of being hired as a head coach. But I look here, if I only look at offensive and defensive coordinators and say, okay, if I limit my analysis to just offensive and defensive coordinators, what's the effect of being white on being promoted to head coach? We get something that's not different from 0. This one, they changed the time frame, so they look before the Rooney Rule and after the Rooney Rule, the same question. And they see, okay, the sign changes here, but there's actually, these aren't any different from 0 either. So they instituted the Rooney Rule, and ultimately it looks like they really didn't, need to, and that even before and after there was no change, right? All of these estimates we can't say are any different from 0. That being white has any impact on being promoted to head coach from a coordinator position. Now, so that, good news, I guess, there. Make sure I didn't have something in the chat. I thought I saw it flashing. Okay. Then what they did is say, well, look, maybe it's not that there's discrimination going on at the offensive and defensive coordinator. There's also head coaches who get promoted from non-coordinator positions, from being a running back coach or from being a quarterback coach. So if we include kind of everyone here, well, then what's the probability that they get hired to a head coach? So we're skipping a column for a second. But notice now we get a statistically significant estimate that's greater than any of the estimates we had before. So it's saying a white candidate, right, holding constant all these other things, right, whether or not they were a coordinator, what year it was, their coaching experience, their age. They had a performance measure. So what their I think whatever position coach they were, they looked at where their team ranked in the percentile compared to all their teams. So we're trying to hold quality constant, that there's a much larger, right, it increases the probability that they get promoted to head coach by about 0.7, right? There's a pretty sizable impact given that the highest probability you could ever see is 1, right? So maybe, the probability that I'm getting promoted from these other positions to a head coach, that's where kind of white candidates are given more opportunities than black candidates. It's not from the coordinator position. It's from these other kind of positional coaching, or what do they call them? Positional coaches, like they only coach wide receivers or running backs. So it's kind of interesting. Also, they did the same thing, but they changed the y variable to not just did you get promoted to head coach, but also is it less or more likely you get promoted to other positions like coordinator, right? So if I include that I got any promotion, so not just a head coach, but maybe to coordinators, we also see that white candidates are more likely to get promoted to those coordinator positions, which we know coordinator positions have the highest percent likelihood of kind of being promoted to a head coach. So really this doesn't start out, this isn't like a within job discrimination, right? People who have the same position, defensive, offensive coordinators, race doesn't matter here. However, we have kind of this allocative discrimination where if it's more likely for black coaches to be hired on, into positions that aren't as likely to get promoted to head coach, well, then we're going to see that white candidates are given more opportunities, right? Going from, say, a quarterback coach to a head coach. And they kind of find statistically significant evidence of that. So they also did a similar thing, and they broke it down to just what's the increase. I think they had more control variables here, so they, a little bit better controlled for the quality differences. And they find similar effects here for being promoted to a head coach. But the one interesting thing here was promotion to a coordinator, so offensive or defensive coordinator. And if we looked at kind of the coefficient on white there, this also shows that white coaches are more likely to be given opportunities or promoted to a coordinator position as well. And this specifically identifies that, where they change the Y variable to be, did you get promoted to a coordinator? Okay. What I want to say here. Oh, and you know, they start to include like what kind of coach the player or what kind of positions coach that the coach was. And that kind of eliminates the effect. So really this highlights that it's really operating through these positions that the coaches are initially being hired to. All right, so we got 25 minutes. So this paper exists. Oh, I'm not lying to you. So how might you find it? So we've talked a little bit about Google Scholar. I just type in Scholar to Google and it's the first thing that comes up. It's easier than trying to type out scholar.google for me. So we might be interested in something like, okay, racial discrimination, NFL coaches, right? That's kind of the topic or the idea we were talking about. So we might want to see, okay, what's been done already on this? I hit enter and I kind of see all these different outputs. So I believe this is the paper, if I remember the guy's name correctly. So if I click on the PDF, let's see if we see some of the, oh, it looks like this might be a different paper. But this would be another one. If I'm writing my project up, I could add this to my lit review. What's the one? I should remember his name. It might be. Yeah, I think this is the one. Yeah, this is just a cleaned up version. So right, that's where that 73% was coming from. So we can kind of Google search and find a bunch of different papers. And like some of them you might not be able to observe. So if I select on this one, I need like access to this journal, right? So when you're using Google Scholar to kind of build that lit review, you know, for the sake of this class, if you know, we're really trying to write a paper that was gonna be peer reviewed and things like that, we would try to get our hands on these. But for the sake of this class, just look for the ones where there's a publicly available PDF. And that kind of shows up right here on the right-hand side, right? Yeah, so there's quite a few papers on this. This is your topic. It'd be probably pretty easy to build your lit review. Right. What was the other one? I don't want to talk about this one, teen height and sports participation. I had another paper that I thought was interesting that we could talk about today. So, and I haven't, to be honest, I knew this paper existed. I haven't completely read through this, but I wanted to bring it in today because I think it's interesting. So this question of this paper is essentially whether or not there's consumer discrimination. And the idea is that they're going to identify it. If I can get up to the title. They're going to identify it through social media, right? So they're going to identify, okay, if we can control for all this player quality, all their performance, there shouldn't be any difference in their social media followings, right? If they're the same quality player, then fans, if they don't care about race, right, should be willing to follow a white and black player of the same quality in equal amount. So they have this regression in mind. Did I skip it? There it is. Where they're going to use as their dependent variable the number of, I think they use Twitter followers here. It's a little bit older. I should have used something else, but Twitter followers here. And they control for like all these different things. So they've got the player performance, the number of games they're in, you know, if the team that they were on had more followers, right? So they're trying to, you know, control for that, the position the player plays. They then look at, okay, the city that the person or the player plays in, what's the population, what's the demographic breakdown of that city, right? Because, you know, maybe that if it's a thing where individuals are just more likely to follow people of someone of their own race, and maybe that's causing it. Well, no, we can control for that. We control for whether or not the player is white or African-American, Spanish. So these coefficients should pick up kind of this discrimination if it's going on. All-star votes, another way to kind of control for quality, the team quality, win percentage. So we're really comparing otherwise identical players. They're on a team that has the same following, a city with similar demographics, same kind of player production, same age, right? We've got all these things. So if we go down and look at their results, and to be clear, they're using Major League Baseball here in the followers. So if we look down here, here's our kind of race identifiers, right? And this is going to be relative to whether or not the player is white. So these coefficients, we kind of see that Hispanic and African American players have fewer follows. Holding all this other stuff constant, right? We predict that if you're African American baseball player, you'd have fewer Twitter followers, and quite a few, 16,000, right? Now, you'll notice this isn't really, none of these are this, at least this estimate, right? These aren't statistically significant, right? There's no stars on the estimates here. And there's really kind of the only stars we pick up is actually on the Hispanic players. So if you're Hispanic, there's a statistically significant fact that you're going to have fewer Twitter followers. So some evidence of consumer discrimination, right? Or at least that they have preferences that depend on race, which, you know, by definition is discrimination. And they started to look at a couple other things. They try to build in some better performance measures. And if you look at kind of the results we have here, right, here's our three coefficients. Now we start to get some statistically significance, not on whether or not the player is black, but actually that Asian baseball players are more likely to have a higher number of followers, right? So there's evidence of, you know, discrimination going on in multiple directions here. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting, I mean, this is specifically for pitchers as opposed to batters. So maybe it's also dependent on position, right? Whether or not what consumer discrimination is. But a pretty interesting paper, some interesting findings. I think it shows you what you can do. Like, you know, this would have been a pretty laborious project because they would have had to go out and get the Twitter followers of like all the, I mean, there's probably some web scraping program you could use, but it still would have been some work to go out and get the Twitter followers for each one of these players. But if you could, right now I can identify at a different level, what does it look like consumers care about race in terms of kind of whether or not they follow the individual? There was also another interesting paper that I wanted to bring up, which was whether or not there's racial discrimination in professional basketball. So the idea of this paper is that maybe consumers are discriminatory, and we can look and see whether or not TV views are higher or lower depending on the racial breakdown of the teams that are playing, right? So, you know, to put it crudely, if a basketball team has more black players on it, are we seeing lower TV views of that game, right? So they come down here. Should have a regression equation outlined somewhere. Okay, so they don't break it down, but I can break it down for you. So they're going to use all these kind of variables as controls. You know, if the game was prime time, you know, number of all-star members, so trying to control for the quality, the win percentage of the team and the opponent. And what they find, their Y variable here, we can think about is TV views. Right, and I shouldn't say it's TV. There's a rating system with Nielsen, but it equates to TV viewership. So holding all this other stuff constant, if we look at, let me see if I can find it. So, what was it? WH playoff. You got to remember what, because they abbreviate things so crazy. So percentage of total team. Winning percentage, number of white. Okay, so number of white players on team's roster. So WH play LOC. WH play LOC. Here we go. So this is the number of white players on the team's roster. So what this is telling us, if they have one more white player on their roster, what's the predicted change in that Nielsen rating, which essentially is telling us how many people are watching the game, some TV viewership. Notice these are all positive and all statistically significant. So here we found evidence that the number of white players on a roster potentially can increase TV viewership. Bad news again, evidence that there's potentially some consumer discrimination going on here. I think they have another another table where they look at it in a similar way. Oh, they try to do something income. I mean, this is the bulk of their finding, right? That one more white player kind of increases this Nielsen rating. So we've got all kinds of evidence of consumer discrimination that exists in the different sports labor markets, whether or not that's for coaches or players. Another one I would always thought would have been interesting is to do a similar thing with Nielsen ratings, but you could actually look and see, a sport maybe where like you have kind of white versus black quarterbacks and try to see if we can estimate any consumer discrimination that might exist there as well. But that would be a similar idea to what they did with the NBA data there. So, all right. I think I might let us out a little bit early here today. We're kind of 15 minutes early. Unless anybody has any questions for me. I know that homework is due by the end of the day tomorrow. I'll be pretty unavailable tomorrow afternoon. So if you have questions, try to send me them late tonight. I can try to get to them early in the morning. Other than that, I will see you guys on Tuesday. Okay?
Data sets that you sent us?